Today's Cloudcast is sponsored by Datadog, a cloud-scale monitoring service that provides comprehensive visibility into cloud, hybrid, and multi-cloud environments with over 350 integrations. Datadog unifies your metrics, logs, and distributed request traces in one platform so that you can investigate and troubleshoot issues across every layer of your stack. Use Datadog's rich, customizable dashboards and algorithmic alerts to ensure redundancy across multi-cloud deployments and monitor cloud migrations in real time. Try Datadog for yourself with a free trial, and you'll receive a complimentary t-shirt. That 14-day trial can be found just by going to datadog.com/cloudcast. That's datadog.com/cloudcast.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody is doing well. I'm just slightly under the weather, not under the weather so much, just a little bit of allergies in my voice, if you can probably hear that. Hope everybody is doing well. Obviously, as far as cloud news of the week, nothing is dominating the news more than the COVID-19 or coronavirus. Hope everybody is safe and well. Hope everybody is practicing good hygiene and taking care of the people around you and just doing all the things that you need to do to make sure that you stay safe out there. That's the most important thing. I know a lot of things are getting canceled at this point in time. Those hopefully are just temporary things. We will see some things begin to come back and eventually get back to normal. But for now, everybody, please take care of yourself. The folks here at Cloudcast want to make sure that you're safe and your family's safe and so forth. Now, let's get to a little bit of cloud news of the week. Not a super busy news week, but a few things maybe of interest. First and foremost, I've joked a little bit that 2020 has become the year of the mainframe. We saw Red Hat OpenShift begin to ship on the Z platform. We saw Google Cloud acquire a company that does cloud mainframe transitions and moving applications from mainframes over into the cloud. And this week we saw BMC acquire CompuWare. So CompuWare, very well known for doing management of mainframe environments, and BMC having some specialization in that space as well. Some further consolidation around the mainframe space. So interesting to see that happen. Salesforce further continued making acquisitions to get into industry-specific clouds. They acquired Velocity for $1.3 billion. They had been valued at around $163 million in funding, go out at $1.3 billion. They specialize in sort of industry-specific vertical clouds and data around those clouds, specifically health, government, communications, and entertainment. So Salesforce continues to ramp up around a lot of vertical-specific types of cloud information and cloud data. We mentioned Mirantis a few weeks ago, that Mirantis was kind of doubling down on some of the Docker technology. Boris Rensky, who was one of the co-founders of Mirantis, has left the company. He is moving on to some other edge computing types of things. So interesting to see sort of the end of an era. Boris was one of the people who was very, very vocal early on in the OpenStack days, was trying to really position OpenStack against VMware, whereas others were trying to position it against AWS. He was very much trying to position it against VMware. So sorry to see him go, but sort of an early pioneer in the OpenStack space, and somebody we were talking about 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago here on the Cloudcast. And then finally, for those of you that are still following Docker, now that Docker is a much smaller company, they did release a product roadmap this week, sort of really focusing on Docker Desktop and Docker Hub, some of the things that they plan to do around that. So links are in the show notes. You can take a look at what's going on there. So today's interview, we're going to focus quite a bit around collaboration, around people working from home, and some very, very interesting things happening around GitHub in particular. So I hope you're going to enjoy the interview. Let's get to that right after the break. Today's show is brought to you by MongoDB. When you need to focus on building applications, do you want to get bogged down by your database? Definitely not. MongoDB is an intuitive, flexible document database that lets you get to building. MongoDB's document model is a natural way to represent data so you can focus on what matters. And MongoDB Atlas is the best way to use MongoDB. It's a global cloud database service that gives you all the developer productivity of MongoDB, plus the added simplicity of a fully managed database service. You can get started for free with MongoDB Atlas at mongodb.com/atlas. That's mongodb.com/atlas. And we're back. And folks, if you've been listening to the show for a while, you know that we have talked for a long time about different ways in which we're seeing companies build new types of applications and some of the change that goes on in organizations as they are, building distributed applications, building applications with distributed teams and so forth. And all of those things introduce a decent amount of change within organizations. It means that we're going to collaborate differently. It means we're going to communicate how changes are happening, what roadmaps look like, and so forth. And we've kind of dabbled around the edges of it, but we've never really dove into it maybe in the depth that we need to. So very, very excited today to have with us Aaron Upright, who is the co-founder of ZenHub. Aaron, welcome to the show. Good to have you on.
Hey, thanks for having me, Brian. Really appreciate it.
So, before we dive into ZenHub a little bit, give me some of your background because, prior to founding the company, a lot of experience around communities, around things that need collaboration. But give us a little bit of your background and then what ultimately drove you to co-found ZenHub.
Yeah, so I'm one of the founding team members, as you mentioned, of ZenHub, and I work really closely on our go-to-market team. So broadly, what that involves is working really closely with our customers, making sure that they have the best experience with the product possible. Now, from kind of a background perspective, I'm probably not an obvious person to be starting a developer tool company. I actually did a year of engineering when I was in school or in university. Then actually, I dropped out and I switched over into a business program. But I've always really been interested in, being close to emerging technologies, and that's really what led me down the path of starting my first career kind of post-graduation, which was at an innovation studio or a product innovation studio up in Vancouver called Axiom Zen. And it was actually through Axiom Zen that I had the opportunity to create the initial product for what ZenHub was.
Interesting. So let's dive a little bit into ZenHub, kind of the things that it does. Give us a sense. As I look at it, there's a couple of things that are really kind of intriguing to me. Part of it is the way that it helps drive developers, and then there's an aspect of it to GitHub. But give us an overview of what ZenHub, not only what it does, but ultimately kind of the types of problems you feel like it really addresses for companies.
Yeah, so you can think about ZenHub as like a project management power-up essentially for GitHub. So we take advantage of a lot of the existing collaboration parts of GitHub, like issues and labels and milestones. And then we add a lot of additional features just to make it a really powerful tool so teams can use ZenHub and GitHub as kind of as track and plan solution. So that includes things that we add like story point estimation, the ability to kind of combine multiple issues together into epics. We add our own series of kind of reports around that data as well, so teams can start to leverage some insights from ZenHub and start to pull insights out of what they're doing inside of GitHub. And then most recently, we actually added a road mapping part of our product as well, which I know we'll be talking a little bit more about today. But in terms of what we actually give back to teams and kind of the capabilities that ZenHub really unlocks is the ability to do project management in a way that's really closely tied back to the code. And people don't really naturally think about project management when they think about GitHub, but I think there's a really clear advantage of actually layering project management tools on top of where people are already working or on top of GitHub issues in the way that we do. And the biggest advantage there is that it allows developers or people who are actually doing the work to continue working where they're most productive. And it really reduces the amount of context switching that developers and engineers have to do in order to switch over to these other project management tools and have to update what they're working on. So ultimately what that really leads to and what we kind of deliver is that better experience for the developers so that they're not being forced out of the environments where they're most comfortable and where they're actually most productive in order to update tools that the rest of the business benefits from. What we've also really found, though, is that leads to a much better experience for project managers as well, because the data that they end up working with and the data that's in the system, I think, is more accurate than any other system out there because it actually reflects what's happening in the code base. It's not based on manual updates. So if I had to kind of summarize it, beyond just being kind of a project management tool and adding features and enhancements into GitHub's UI to help teams track and plan, we really are helping create that single source of truth for project management around GitHub and helping teams leverage that platform for more than just version control so that they can drive their entire process from within GitHub and side by side with their code base.
Yeah, no, it makes a ton of sense. I mean, it's if you're a developer today, so if you sort of think about the ecosystem of development team, project management team, program management team, and then maybe kind of who are their immediate customers. It's some combination of Slack, it's email, it's Jira, it's Atlassian, it's all these other things, plus GitHub. And yeah, just having, like you said, having sort of a single source of truth, not having to move things from one place to another, not having to say like, well, this tool has this concept of labels and tags, or this is how they represent priority, and then in this other tool, it's some other thing. I think the more we're going to see kind of integrations, like you said, around the single source of truth, I think becomes really, really powerful. Now, one of the things that, like you mentioned, that you're beginning to highlight more and more is around roadmaps. And I think roadmaps are kind of fascinating because, everybody always wants to know, okay, what's coming next? When exactly is it going to be done? But talk to us about the way that you guys are thinking about roadmaps and how, just some of the things that you find you're able to communicate because you have this more of a single source of truth.
Yeah, so I would say for this particular feature or part of our product that we developed, ZenHub Roadmaps, we probably did more customer development and use case mapping around this feature than for any other feature that we built in the past. And as we started to reach out to teams, both within our customer base and even outside of our customer base, we started to notice two patterns really emerge as we were doing this customer development. And when we talked to a lot of smaller teams, what we found is that they were using probably some combination of Google Docs or spreadsheets, and oftentimes that required a ton of manual updates. Those tools weren't really purpose-built, for road mapping and for actually delivering a visual kind of view of what it was that the team was working on. And a lot of teams, the smaller teams especially, didn't really have budget or couldn't really afford those custom or purpose-built tools that were really specific to a road mapping use case. Now, the flip side of that is when we talked to larger teams that did have those purpose-built solutions, we found that oftentimes those solutions weren't integrated back to where teams were actually working, in large part GitHub. And because of that, they still required a ton of manual updates and still required someone's time, almost full time, to actually babysit the tool and make sure that it was kind of kept up to date and actually a useful tool for the team to actually report on their progress from. And when we uncovered those patterns, we saw this huge opportunity to actually build a solution that was truly integrated with where teams were working. And so what we actually launched ended up being the first ever road mapping solution that's entirely built around GitHub data and that automatically stays up to date as your team is doing work inside of GitHub. That was something that was super important for us. We didn't want to have to create this manual overhead for teams to come in and have to update what it was that they were working on. We again wanted in kind of similar fashion to the rest of our tool to take advantage of the existing work that was happening inside of GitHub that developers were doing every single day in order kind of to power, I guess, the progress of roadmap items and make it so that no one ever had to come to this roadmap and kind of manually update it or manually keep it in check.
Yeah, no, I like the design thinking around that. Give me a sense as you're talking through this. One of the big things that happens as companies begin to transform, they begin to develop software differently and so forth. There's always the question of like, okay, well, who should be doing what? And like, how do you divide up, like kind of not so much just purely work, but, kind of who should have visibility and stuff? How do you find that people adopt the tooling around it? Obviously, developers are used to working with GitHub and so forth, but like, how do project managers tend to interact with it? How do the companies that are successful with it, lay out for me who does what and who interacts with what?
Yeah, that's a great question. We realized pretty quickly into this, even as we were kind of building a very purpose-built tool to make developers' lives easier, that software development really is a team sport. And just because you're making, one persona's lives easier, it shouldn't be at the expense of other personas and other individuals on the team that are contributing to the project. We built a great kind of extension and built this great experience to actually deliver project management capabilities inside of GitHub. We realized really quickly that there was members from the team that didn't necessarily feel comfortable inside of GitHub. It wasn't necessarily their environment where they wanted to collaborate. And so we've actually gone to the extent of actually building a lot of functionality around our product as well to make it more accessible depending on what persona you are. So in addition to offering an extension that actually injects our features and functionality directly into GitHub's UI, we also offer a web app that kind of sits as a wrapper around ZenHub and GitHub. And that's really the access point for a lot of non-technical personas that really want to follow along with these updates and follow along with what their teams are doing, but maybe don't want to be spending their entire day inside of GitHub. And I think that's really important, as you think about developing solutions, to be persona focused and to acknowledge that even though we are a very developer-centric tool and our purpose and mission is to kind of make developers' lives easier, we do have to respect and acknowledge that there's a lot of people around software projects that need visibility and need access to this information as well. And that, boils right back down to our roadmap view as well in terms of making that accessible to more people across the company. I think it's a really big theme and a really important theme as more and more companies start to become software centric, that what's happening in the software development parts of the organization gets surfaced to more and more people. And so we were really thoughtful as we were kind of building our solution to make sure that we were addressing different personas that were actually, involved in the processes of planning, that had an active stake in kind of taking that information and then acting upon it, or that even might have an active stake in just interacting with that information to understand what the team is working on, where the priorities of the business are, and for the key initiatives that are being worked on, how far along they are, as you kind of mentioned.
Yeah, no, it makes a ton of sense. I mean, there are lots of people that are familiar with Git, but one of the things that I find a lot of times is you will have these new hot technologies or these things where everybody goes, well, that's just what we do. And for folks who don't live in that every day, and again, it could be GitHub, it could be Slack, it could be whatever. It is very easy that if you just sort of force them to say, well, you must live in that world, you must learn those skills, you must learn, the commands or whatever it might be, that you're going to turn off a lot of those people. And what you're going to do at that point is if you haven't figured out a way to kind of bring them along, and as you mentioned, you sort of have to wrap some things around that. What they're going to do is they're going to go, don't feel comfortable in it. I'm a little embarrassed to even ask about it. So I'm going to become a bottleneck, not on purpose, but just because it's not a thing I know how to do. It's not a thing I'm comfortable with. So it makes a lot of sense that you've taken this core thing, but then been able to go, hey, how do I extend this to the people that are going to be the consumers of it, the customers of it, and so forth. So it makes a ton of sense.
Mm-hmm, for sure. And like I said, software development really is a team sport, and we don't want to feel like we're alienating anyone on that team by providing an experience that is way outside of where their comfort zone is. And I think, like you said, the moment that you really start going down that path and creating these purpose-built solutions that are so specific for one part of that team or one area of that team, you do start to alienate other personas. And I think that's where, like you said, you get a lot of pushback and people that don't want to follow those processes, that don't want to, adapt and learn, new tools or learn new ways of working.
Yeah, no, it's very, very interesting. What are you finding? Obviously, one of the things that's always interesting, you have a thing, kind of a vision in your head of how you think people will begin to use the tool, right? You start off with problems that you're pretty sure that companies have. You build the tool, you think you're going to solve them. What have been some of the learnings you've seen in terms of now providing a level of transparency kind of across teams? Maybe it's for roadmaps or other things, but then also because you have this single source of truth. What are some of the things that surprised you, and what are some of the things that maybe would surprise people if they're like, oh, we start adopting this, these are the second and third order kind of benefits that come out of it?
Yeah, so I think one of the really interesting things just in terms of usage patterns for roadmaps that we maybe didn't anticipate super early on. We thought that when teams, got a hold of this capability, that they kind of really use it as a planning tool, right? That they would be putting items in that roadmap, iterating on them, moving them around. There'd be a lot of activity on that roadmap. But what it's ended up being for a lot of teams is more of a showcase of what they're actually doing. And so we thought there'd be just a ton of activity and a ton of people kind of collaborating and coming together on the roadmap. That isn't always the case, though. And sometimes that is for certain customers that we talk to. They use that as kind of a living, kind of breathing document that kind of reflects the current priorities of the team and where they're at. A lot of teams, though, couldn't get into that mental model, and they kind of wanted to create this perfect roadmap from the start. And so we've actually had to do a lot of coaching around that and kind of talking to teams about, well, here's some best practices about how you can actually get the most out of this particular feature. And it doesn't have to be perfect. It can be a great communication tool, even without it being completely reflective of everything that you're working on. The idea is just start getting stuff down, start getting stuff in the roadmap to communicate what it is that you're working on, and start from there. So.
Yeah, no, that's very cool. There is, I've found over time that, companies, especially, if they're software-driven companies or they're engineering-driven companies, they sort of neglect the thing about where you go, how you collaborate externally, how you communicate, just progress. Like you said, you're using it as a showcase tool. They don't always realize, like, hey, just building the capability, just building the software is part of it. It's obviously an important part, but so is communicating to people status updates. How much progress have you made? How do you put metrics around these things? Essentially marketing activities, things that a software company would do externally. You sometimes have to to teach that they have to do that. And if you can use the tools to help facilitate that, that's very, very powerful as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I'm also a big proponent, because I work with our customers a lot, of if it's working for the customer, and it's maybe not exactly how the tool is supposed to facilitate that or exactly how you're supposed to do it in the tool, but the customer's finding value in that process, who are you to step in and say, that's not the way that it's supposed to be done,
right?
Or we designed the tool so that it could be done in this way, and you're not kind of following this design paradigm, or you're not really following the proper implementation of the tool. I think if at the end of the day, teams are getting value out of how they've implemented your tool and, the process that they've actually built around that, then that's good enough for me. I don't need to come in and overcoach teams on how to use the product in certain ways so that it just better matches with the vision that we have for it. Like I said, if it's working for them, it works for us. And I think it's a really important mentality to kind of adopt, because there is a ton of coaching that we do where we step in and we help teams who need help in the product and need help kind of figuring out different ways to use the product better and to kind of match it with their process and align it with where they kind of want to go and what their goals are. But I think when you get to the point where you're starting to, take things that are working for the team and actually, not avoid suggesting better ways to do things, but replacing those with things that you're just used to from seeing with other customers, I really don't like that approach.
Yeah, no, it's you have to realize that your customers are going to use it in whatever way helps them, and you can take two approaches. Like you said, you can say, hey, that's great, I'm glad you're successful with it, learn from it, or you can be very, very sort of opinionated and pragmatic, and over time that has proven itself to be not necessarily a great strategy for telling your customers the only way they can use your product. So it's good to hear that you're recognizing that and sort of realizing where to step back where it makes sense, and where to educate to help them.
Yeah, for sure.
I want to shift gears a little bit. So I mentioned at the top of the show, one of the things that really kind of drew my attention to what you're doing is it is kind of, essentially integrated into GitHub. And we've been kind of more and more on the show been fascinated by what's happening in GitHub along the lines of, people are always sort of asking like, hey, will anything kind of disrupt some of the major cloud providers? Is there a model that'll be next? And we've been sort of fascinated because for a while they were your source control. Then they started adding collaboration. Then they've added sort of CI and CD pipelines into it. They've begun to add things like actions, which is a little bit of kind of functions as a service, edge computing. Like, was that kind of your driving, mindset of like, hey, people are already there, more functionality is coming there. It wouldn't make any sense any other way than to just be where developers live and start to just build around that ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to say that we kind of had this master plan when we started this 5 years ago, and we had really thought about it in that level of depth, but unfortunately that isn't the case. I mean, we took a really big bet 5 years ago and kind of placed all of our eggs in one basket, and we said, based on the signals that we see in the market today, we think that GitHub is going to continue to be the market leader in this space. Not only are they going to be where developers and open source projects live, but more and more developers are going to come up, through or come up through, school and through programs, having exposure to GitHub and kind of learning this platform. And so for us, the decision wasn't necessarily based on stability or based on, where we kind of predicted the market would go. It was really based on where do we think developers are going to live. A really good signal for us in the early days was where does open source live? And 5 years ago, and still very much today, the world's most important open source projects are on GitHub. And so that was a really good indicator for us that this is a platform on which you could build a successful business or build a successful product, especially if the goal is to get usage and exposure to as many developers as possible. And I'm still very happy with our decision, obviously, to build on top of the platform, but a lot's changed in those 5 years as well. And I think things have changed in a very positive light that have made GitHub an even better platform to build off of as well. So for example, even through the Microsoft acquisition, I think that added a lot of stability around GitHub, just even in terms of not being a product that's going to go away in 5 years or be replaced by something else. It might not be as prominent in the market as it is today, but the risk of GitHub going out of business or it amounting and going away entirely is almost zero at this point. And so I think it's a much safer space than ever to actually build a business or build a developer tool on top of. And then another thing that, has always been really attractive about building on top of GitHub as well, and has always really fascinated me about GitHub, is just how they actually approach their API. GitHub has always been an API first company. They've always prioritized building an extensible and incredibly well documented API. I think it's probably one of the best documented APIs out there. And they actually pride themselves on using the same API endpoints as are available to their integrators and to their customers as well. There's no, I'm sure there are, but there's not a lot of private API endpoints that are GitHub specific or that GitHub knows about that the rest of the community can't access or use. And I think that's a great forcing function to make your API really, really great. Because when you have to use the same endpoints and the same components as the rest of the community and everyone else, well, they better be really good, or else you're damaging your own business and you're damaging your own ability to build great things and to kind of move your business forward if they aren't, world class.
Right. Yeah, no. And I think you hit on a lot of really important points, right? It's you no longer have to worry, okay, they were VC funded. Will they stay around? Because it's obviously not cheap to run, the world's largest source repository. It lets you know that, I think they've sort of reassured the world that, they're going to remain relatively neutral. I mean, Microsoft's backed them. There will be some things that tie it into Azure, but they've still been, very good about collaborating with people. And like you said, they probably do as good a job as anybody at making sure that, they are attracting developers, which means they're going to document their APIs well. They're going to make sure they're compatible. And so, for that ecosystem building around it, it's got to be incredibly reassuring.
Yeah, and I think just touching on, one of the points that you mentioned a little bit earlier, as GitHub has grown, they have stepped into some kind of adjacent spaces around source code management. Particularly you mentioned collaboration being a big part of that and CI/CD being another part of that as well. They still have this very best of breed focus though.
Yeah.
And I think what makes GitHub's position in the market really different, and I think why it's doing so well, is because, unlike some of the other tools in the space, without naming names, they're not trying to be everything to everyone. They're still creating opportunities for people to come in and build these opinionated tools and build these opinionated workflows on top of. They're not saying, hey, we're going to actually have a tool that literally covers everything in the application lifecycle, from when an idea kind of pops up to how that idea actually gets deployed into production as a working piece of code. I think they're focused on building the best source code management and version control platform out there, which is where they should be focused. And they're more than happy to work with partners and integrators to kind of fill in those gaps and to build really opinionated workflows and tools, like I mentioned, without feeling the need to get into those areas so specifically. I think it's really smart, actually, that they provide a lot of the primitives in their product around collaboration and around CI/CD, because those kind of become, I guess, the onboarding ramps or the on-ramps for a lot of teams who end up getting into these products. And so that's another really nice thing about building in this ecosystem as well. A lot of the time when teams are actually coming to ZenHub and saying, hey, we want to use your product, they have some exposure to GitHub issues. Maybe they've used a product board before or a projects board before and have realized that it's not quite what they need from a capabilities perspective. Maybe they're a bit larger or mature of a team and they want that kind of next level up. It's a really great on-ramp into our product. And those same on-ramps exist for a lot of other spaces and a lot of other products in the ecosystem as well.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I want to ask you one last question before we wrap up. In terms of the companies that work with you today, are they primarily what you would consider to be software companies? Are they companies that just have software divisions, or is that line kind of becoming blurred? And what do you learn from those two different types of companies, right? The ones that are just software companies versus the ones that it's a part of supporting their business.
Yeah, these lines are definitely getting blurred. And it's a surprising amount of interactions that we have these days, I would say, with non-traditional software companies. So businesses that aren't software based, but are really transforming their business in terms of how they're building and how they're using software. In fact, one of my favorite companies that we're working with right now is an agricultural commodities and services company. It was founded, I think, more than 150 years ago. And so they don't have a historical background in technology, and it's not tech enabled across the entire business. But they operate on a global scale, and in order to do that and to remain competitive, they've really had to transform their entire business around technology. And so it's been really, really fun to work with them as they're going through this digital transformation and moving everything over to be somewhat software empowered or somewhat software enabled. And it's just a really exciting time to work with them as they're kind of going through that transition and to be a product that they're using to kind of help drive a lot of that. And I think this kind of trend of more and more businesses becoming software enabled or more and more businesses being based around software, is going to continue to happen. Software is going to become even more and more core to every single business, which is why I think it's so important that we kind of bring visibility into what development teams are working on, because eventually the entire business is going to have an invested stake in seeing what these software projects are, how far along they are, where the blockers are. And that's why I think, road mapping is not just a feature we wanted to build, it's such an important solution for us, or such an important part of the equation for us, because as these businesses transform around software, more and more people are going to start touching these projects and be really, really interested in, seeing how these projects are actually going. So,
yeah, no, I think it's great, and I think what I always find is like you said, yeah, the line is becoming incredibly blurred, but it's become such a mainstream thing that every company has to have. We definitely need a set of tools and capabilities around it that aren't just for the bleeding edge for anymore. It's something that has to be applicable for the mainstream. For as we've been talking throughout this conversation about, it's got to be able to touch a lot of different groups, right? Like you said, software development's a team sport. Well, Aaron, I'm gonna kind of wrap it up with that. If folks want to learn more about you or what ZenHub's doing, what's the best way to reach out? What's the best way to either work with the company or directly interact with you?
Yeah, so if you want to check out ZenHub, we're over at zenhub.com. You can check out the product there, get started with a free trial for 14 days. If you want to get in touch with me directly, it's just my first name, Aaron, at zenhub.com. That's my email. And if you want to connect with me on Twitter, I'm at Aaron Upright on Twitter, and we can probably leave that in the link kind of post show as well. But always love to have conversations with people on Twitter and carry on the conversation around agile, around GitHub, around productivity, and how we can make teams better.
Yeah, very, very cool. Well, Aaron, thank you again for the time today, folks. It was fun digging into, again, how do we better collaborate? How do we better build software? And how do we bring more of the organization together on this? So with that, I'm going to wrap it up. I want to thank everybody for listening, for telling a friend, for rating the show on iTunes and other places, and we will talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.